My fiancé's ex-wife sent me a strange Christmas present, and when I found out what it meant, I had to start hiring lawyers. 2 days ago, I received a package in the mail from my fiancé's ex-wife, Katrina. Inside was a huge silver spoon set, and a card that read, "You'll need these just like I did." And that was it. My fiancé laughed it off and said she was just being dramatic. But something about it shook me. Like, what exactly does that mean? Just like I did? And why did he call her dramatic? How can a spoon be dramatic? I feel guilty about it, but I texted Katrina because I needed answers. I told her I appreciated the gift but found her note confusing. She replied with, "You'll understand after your first Christmas married to him." Naturally, I was even more confused. I tried everything to get answers. Forums, online queries, subtly asking my husband. Nothing worked. Until Christmas Day arrived. My husband's family came over as we were hosting. I set the table that morning using Katrina's spoons because I wanted to see if anyone would react. Maybe someone would finally tell me what they meant. My fiancé walked into the dining room and completely froze like a deer in headlights. "What's wrong?" He shook his head. "Nothing. Just use the other spoon set instead." "Why?" "Just please," he said, his voice tight. That just made me more determined to use them. His mother arrived first around noon. She was carrying a casserole dish when she saw the spoons. The dish literally slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. She put her hand over her mouth and stared at my fiancé with shock and anger. "Why does she have those?" she asked directly, her voice shaking. "Katrina sent them to me," I said. "What are they?" She started crying, shaking her head and looking at my fiancé. "He needs to tell you about these." "Tell me what?" I asked, completely lost. She turned to glare at my fiancé, who practically pushed her toward the kitchen. More family members started arriving after that. His sister, his aunt and uncle, some cousins. Everybody who walked into the dining room and saw those spoons got this weird, uncomfortable look. People were whispering to each other and shooting looks at my fiancé, who was avoiding everyone's eyes. His sister finally grabbed both of us and pulled us into the kitchen away from everyone. "Are you seriously not going to tell her?" she demanded. "Stay out of this," my fiancé said. "Tell me what?" I practically yelled. His sister's face changed from anger to pity. "Those spoons are from Christmas 5 years ago." "Okay. What happened 5 years ago on Christmas?" I asked. She stared hard at my fiancé. "You tell her right now, or I'm calling Katrina." My fiancé looked panicked for the first time. "You wouldn't do that." "Try me," his sister said coldly. "You have until dinner." Then I'm telling her myself. She walked away, and my fiancé just stood there staring at the floor, unable to look at me. When it was time to serve dinner, I picked up those big serving spoons. The entire room went completely silent. His mother said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Are you seriously not going to tell her?" My fiancé suddenly slammed his hand down on the table. "Enough. All of you just stop." "Stop what?" I asked, still holding the spoons. "Someone needs to tell me what these are." His aunt spoke up from across the table. "Tell her what happened. She deserves to know what kind of man you really are." "What does she mean?" I looked at my fiancé. "What is everyone talking about?" He wouldn't look at me. "Put the spoons down," he finally said quietly. "No," I yelled. "Tell me what they mean." That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen. There were small dents and scratches all over the spoon's handles. I held one up to the light and looked closer. They looked like impact marks, like something had been hitting them over and over. His mother saw me examining and burst into tears again. "Just tell her what you did." "Why are these damaged?" I asked my fiancé directly. The whole room was staring at him now. Every single person was on my side, not his. That's when his mother couldn't wait anymore. She stood up and through choked sobs started speaking. "Katrina lost her baby on Christmas Day 5 years ago." I was confused. "Okay, I knew that." "So what?" His sister's voice was shaking with anger. "What you don't know is he wouldn't take her to the hospital. She was hemorrhaging on her bathroom floor. But he told her they had guests coming over. He made her come downstairs and host Christmas dinner while she was actively losing the baby." My fiancé tried to interrupt. "It wasn't like—" "Yes, it was!" his mother screamed at him. "I watched that poor girl serve us food while she was dying inside and too scared to tell anyone what was happening. I felt like I was going to be sick. But what do these spoons have to do with that?" The only sound was my fiancé gulping. His aunt spoke up quietly. After it was over, he wouldn't pay for Katrina to go to the hospital. He wouldn't let her have a funeral. She picked up one of the spoons. Her hand was shaking. Katrina had to bury their baby in the backyard. The room started spinning around me. He wouldn't even give her a shovel. She looked down at the rest of the spoons on the table. She used these exact spoons to dig her baby's grave in frozen December ground. I looked up at my fiancé. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air for maybe 2 seconds before everything exploded into chaos. My fiancé's mother let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. His aunt covered her mouth with both hands. His sister's eyes went wide and then immediately filled with tears. I watched my fiancé's face change from pale shock to something darker, something that made my stomach drop even further than it already had. His jaw clenched tight and his hands curled into fists on the table. The look he gave me wasn't concern or surprise. It was anger mixed with something that looked like calculation, like he was already figuring out how to control this situation. That look made my decision for me. I had to get out of that house right now. My legs felt shaky when I stood up from the table, but I forced them to move. I grabbed one of the serving spoons without thinking, just needing something physical to hold on to. Proof that this was all real. My purse was on the chair by the door where I'd left it that morning. My coat hung on the rack next to it. I moved toward them on autopilot while voices erupted behind me. My fiancé's mother was crying harder now, saying something about history repeating itself. His sister was yelling at him, her voice sharp and furious. I heard my fiancé push his chair back hard enough that it scraped loudly across the floor. His footsteps came after me fast. I grabbed my coat and purse, fumbling with the doorknob because my hands were shaking so badly. Behind me, my fiancé's voice changed completely. The anger disappeared, and suddenly he sounded smooth and concerned, using that gentle tone he always used when he wanted something from me. He said my name softly, asked me to wait, told me we needed to talk about this calmly. But I'd just heard what he did to Katrina. I'd seen the spoons she used to bury their baby because he wouldn't even let her have a proper funeral. That gentle voice didn't work anymore. I got the door open just as he reached for my arm. His mother's crying got louder from the dining room, a raw sound of guilt and grief. Then his sister was there, moving fast, putting herself between me and her brother. She grabbed his arm and pulled him back, her face set hard. She told him to let me go, that he'd done enough damage. He tried to push past her, but she held firm, and I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran out into the cold December night without looking back. My car was parked in the driveway behind 3 other family cars. I had to squeeze past them, my breath coming out in white puffs in the freezing air. My hands shook so hard I dropped my keys twice before I managed to unlock the door. I threw myself into the driver's seat and locked all the doors immediately, then just sat there gripping the steering wheel. Through the front window of the house, I could see shapes moving, people arguing. The Christmas lights we'd strung up together last week blinked red and green across the snow. It looked so normal from out here, so peaceful. Nobody driving past would know what had just happened inside. My phone started buzzing in my purse. I pulled it out and saw a text from my fiancé. It said we needed to talk, that I was overreacting, that I needed to come back inside, so we could discuss this like adults. Another text came through before I could even process the first one. This one said his family was being dramatic about something that happened years ago, that they were making it sound worse than it was, that I didn't understand the full context. A third text appeared. He was sorry I was upset, but I needed to think about our baby and not make rash decisions based on old family drama. The words made me feel sick. Old family drama. Like what he did to Katrina was just some minor disagreement, not forcing her to host dinner while she lost their baby. My phone kept buzzing with more messages, but I couldn't read them anymore. I needed to go somewhere. Anywhere but here. The problem was, I didn't know where. We'd moved to the city for his job 6 months ago, and I didn't have many friends here yet. My family lived 3 states away. Most of our social circle was his co-workers and their wives. Then I remembered Haley. She'd been my roommate in college and lived across town now. We'd gotten coffee a few times since I moved here, but hadn't stayed as close as we should have. I hadn't even told her much about my fiancé because he always got weird when I spent too much time with old friends. That thought made something click in my head, a small piece of a bigger pattern I was just starting to see. I pulled up the GPS on my phone with shaking fingers and typed in Haley's address from my contacts. The route showed 20 minutes across town. I started the car and backed out of the driveway carefully, checking the rearview mirror to make sure my fiancé wasn't coming after me. The house stayed still behind me as I drove away. Once I hit the main road, my mind started replaying the past year like a movie on fast forward. All the times he'd suggested I didn't need to work because he made enough money for both of us. How he'd been annoyed when I wanted to visit my parents for Thanksgiving. The way he always checked my phone casually, like it was no big deal, just being interested in my life. How he'd convinced me to put his name on my bank account for easier bill paying. The time he'd gotten upset because I bought groceries without asking him first, even though I was using my own money. Each memory felt different now, tainted by what I knew about Katrina. These weren't just quirks or signs he cared about me. They were control. The traffic lights blurred together as I drove, my brain struggling to process everything at once. Every time I stopped at a red light, I checked my phone. More texts kept coming through. He was sorry. He loved me. We could work through this. His family didn't understand what really happened. Katrina had always been unstable. He'd made mistakes when he was younger, but he'd changed. We were supposed to get married in 3 months. I was carrying his baby. Didn't that mean something? Each message made my stomach hurt worse. Haley's apartment building looked warm and safe when I finally pulled into the parking lot. I grabbed my purse and coat, along with the serving spoon I'd somehow carried with me this whole time. The metal felt cold even through my glove. I made my way to her door on the 2nd floor and knocked, praying she was home on Christmas night. Footsteps came quickly, and then the door opened. Haley took one look at my face and her expression changed from surprise to concerned in an instant. She didn't ask questions, just pulled me inside and locked the door behind us. Her apartment was small but cozy, decorated with colorful throw pillows and art prints. She guided me to her couch and disappeared into the kitchen. I heard water running and cabinets opening. I sat there in my coat, still holding the spoon, unable to make my body move or my brain form words. Haley came back with a mug of tea and a soft blanket. She wrapped the blanket around my shoulders and pressed the warm mug into my hands. Then she sat down next to me and waited. She didn't push or demand explanations. She just waited until I was ready. My phone buzzed again in my purse. And again. And again. The sound seemed too loud in the quiet apartment. Haley glanced at my purse but didn't say anything about it. It took until almost midnight before I could finally tell her what happened. The words came out choppy and confused at first, jumping around in time. I started with the spoons arriving 2 days ago, then jumped to tonight's dinner, then back to texting Katrina, then forward to the moment I said I was pregnant. Haley listened without interrupting once. Her face got darker and darker as I explained about Katrina losing the baby, about her having to serve dinner while hemorrhaging, about using these exact spoons to dig a grave in frozen ground. When I finished, Haley was quiet for a long moment. Then she said I could stay as long as I needed, that we'd figure this out together, that I wasn't alone in this. She asked if she could see the spoons. I pulled the one I'd grabbed from my purse and handed it to her. She examined the dents and scratches on the handle, running her finger over the marks carefully. Her jaw was tight when she looked back at me. She asked if I was safe, if he knew where I was, if he'd ever hurt me physically. I told her no to the physical part, but I wasn't sure about the rest anymore. Everything I'd thought was normal in our relationship suddenly looked different now. Haley suggested we document everything before I responded to any of his messages. She got her laptop and we started going through my phone together. There were over 30 texts from my fiancé by this point. We took screenshots of every single one, especially the ones where he minimized what happened or tried to manipulate me into coming home. The ones where he called his family dramatic. The ones where he said Katrina was unstable. The ones where he reminded me about our wedding plans and the baby. Like those things meant I had to forgive him for everything. After we'd documented all the messages, Haley asked if I wanted to respond. I knew I should probably just block him and not engage, but I also knew he'd escalate if I went completely silent. I typed out one careful text that said I needed space and time to think, and that I'd contact him when I was ready. My finger hovered over the send button for a few seconds before I pressed it. His response came back in under a minute. The message was long, full of promises that we could work through this together. He said he understood I was upset, but reminded me about all our plans for the future. The wedding we'd been planning, the house we were going to buy, the life we were supposed to build. He said he'd made mistakes in his past, but he'd learned from them. He loved me. He'd never do anything to hurt me or our baby. But all I could see when I read his words was Katrina on her bathroom floor, bleeding and scared, while he worried about dinner guests. I could see her in the frozen backyard with those silver spoons, digging through hard December ground because he wouldn't pay for a funeral. I could see her serving food to his family while losing their baby because he cared more about appearances than her life. His promises meant nothing compared to what he'd actually done. I put my phone down and told Haley I couldn't read any more tonight. Sleep didn't come easy on Haley's couch, but I must have dozed off eventually because I woke up to her moving around the kitchen making coffee. My phone sat on the coffee table where I'd left it, the screen dark and silent for once. Haley brought me a mug and asked how I was feeling. I told her the truth, that I felt numb and confused and scared all at the same time. She sat down across from me and suggested I spend the day researching what I was dealing with, that understanding it might help me figure out my next steps. So that's what I did. I opened my laptop and started searching. Terms like coercive control and reproductive abuse. Articles about emotional manipulation and financial control. Websites about recognizing the signs of abuse that doesn't leave physical marks. Every single article I read described things I recognized from my relationship with my fiancé. The way he'd slowly isolated me from friends and family. How he controlled our money even though I had my own income. The subtle ways he'd made me feel like I needed his permission for basic decisions. How he'd react with anger or cold silence when I did things without asking him first. Then I found articles specifically about reproductive coercion. Men who tamper with birth control. Who pressure partners into pregnancy. Who use pregnancy to trap women in relationships. I remembered how excited my fiancé had been when I got pregnant. How quickly he'd started talking about moving up the wedding date. How he'd suggested I quit my job since I'd need to be home with the baby anyway. The pattern had been there all along in smaller ways. I just didn't have the words for it until now. Haley had to leave for a shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse, but she made me promise to call her if anything happened. After she left, I kept researching until my eyes hurt from staring at the screen. Then I remembered I needed to call my doctor. I was pregnant, and I'd just been through something incredibly stressful. I needed to make sure everything was okay with the baby, even though I still didn't know how I felt about being pregnant with this man's child. I pulled up my OB/GYN's number as soon as their office opened at 8. The receptionist who answered was cheerful at first, wishing me a happy day after Christmas. Then I started explaining why I needed an emergency appointment and my voice cracked halfway through. I didn't give her all the details, just said I'd discovered something really upsetting about my fiancé, and I was very stressed, and I needed to be seen today to make sure the baby was okay. The cheerfulness dropped from her voice immediately, and she told me to hold on. She came back a minute later with an appointment slot at 11, telling me to come in even if I wasn't having any physical symptoms, because stress mattered too. I thanked her and hung up, then sat there on Haley's couch staring at the silver spoon on the coffee table. In a few hours, I'd go to the doctor and face the reality of this pregnancy. But right now, in this moment, all I could think about was Katrina digging in frozen ground, while the man who should have protected her sat inside their warm house. Before leaving for the appointment at 11, I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures of every single spoon. I photographed them from above, from the sides, close-ups of the handles where the dents and scratches marked each impact against frozen ground. The morning light through Haley's window caught the damage perfectly, showing every mark that told Katrina's story. Haley sat next to me on the couch with a notebook, asking me questions about the dinner to help me remember everything clearly. She wrote down who said what, starting with his mother's reaction to seeing the spoons, and ending with his aunt explaining how Katrina dug the grave. We documented the exact wording of the card Katrina sent, the way my fiancé tried to make me use different spoons, how every family member reacted with horror when they understood what the spoons meant. Haley's handwriting filled 3 pages by the time we finished, creating a record of everything before my memory could blur the details. The drive to the doctor's office felt surreal, like I was watching myself move through the world from somewhere far away. I checked in at the front desk and sat in the waiting room staring at a magazine without seeing the words. When the nurse called my name, I followed her back to the exam room and stepped on the scale, gave a urine sample, let her take my blood pressure. Then Brianna walked in with her usual warm smile and asked how I was doing. That's when I completely fell apart. I started crying so hard I couldn't breathe, and the whole story came pouring out between sobs about the spoons and the Christmas dinner, and Katrina digging in frozen ground and my fiancé forcing her to host while she was losing their baby. Brianna handed me tissues and listened without interrupting, and when I finally stopped talking, she pulled her chair closer and told me she'd seen this before. She said leaving now showed strength, not weakness, that recognizing the danger meant I was protecting myself and my baby, and that she would help me through whatever I decided about the pregnancy. Her calm acceptance made me cry harder because I'd been so scared she would judge me or tell me I was overreacting. Brianna examined me after I calmed down enough to lie back on the table. She did an ultrasound and showed me the tiny shape on the screen, explaining that everything looked normal with the pregnancy so far. The baby was measuring right on track for 8 weeks. The heartbeat was strong and steady. But then she wrapped the blood pressure cuff around my arm again and frowned at the numbers. She said my stress levels were clearly affecting my body, that my blood pressure was higher than she wanted to see, and that I needed to take this seriously for both my health and the baby's. She printed out 3 referrals while I got dressed, explaining each one carefully. The first was for a therapist named Jasmine who specialized in trauma and something called reproductive coercion, which Brianna said was when someone uses pregnancy to control their partner. The second referral was for a domestic violence advocate named Nicole, who could help me understand my options and stay safe. The third was for a family law attorney named Colin, who had experience with cases like mine. Brianna explained that I needed a whole team of support right now, that this wasn't something I could handle alone, and that each of these people would help me figure out my next steps. When I got back to Haley's apartment around 1, my brother Barrett was sitting on the couch waiting. Haley had called him that morning after I left, and he'd immediately taken the rest of the week off work to help me. He stood up when I walked in and hugged me so tight I started crying again into his shoulder. He said I wasn't dealing with this alone, that he was here for whatever I needed, and that we'd figure out my next steps together. Having him there made everything feel slightly less impossible, like maybe I could actually survive this. Barrett suggested we make a list of immediate practical needs, instead of letting me spiral into fear about the future. He grabbed the notebook Haley had used earlier and started writing while I talked. We identified that I needed clothes and personal items from the house since I'd left with basically nothing. I needed my important documents like my birth certificate, social security card, and passport. I needed to make sure I had access to my own money since most of our accounts were joint. And we needed a plan for what to do if my fiancé showed up at Haley's apartment looking for me. Barrett wrote everything down in his neat handwriting, turning my panic into concrete actions we could take. He said we'd tackle one thing at a time, starting with the easiest and working up to the harder stuff. Around 3, my fiancé's sister called my cell phone. I almost didn't answer because I was scared it would be him calling from her phone, but Barrett nodded at me to pick up. She said she wanted to pack a bag for me and bring it to a neutral location, somewhere public where I'd feel safe. Then her voice dropped lower and she said she'd gone through her brother's phone last night after everyone left, and she didn't like what she found. She wouldn't give me details over the phone but hinted there were messages to other women and financial things I should know about. She asked if I was somewhere safe, if anyone was with me, and whether I'd talked to a lawyer yet. I told her I was with my brother and my best friend, and she said good, that I needed people around me who would actually protect me, unlike her family had protected Katrina. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop 3 blocks from Haley's apartment at 5. Barrett insisted on coming with me, and Haley left work early to meet us there too. When the sister arrived, she was carrying 2 large duffel bags and a thick folder of papers. She hugged me in the parking lot and apologized for not speaking up sooner, saying she'd suspected her brother was controlling, but didn't realize how bad things were until the dinner. She'd spent all of Christmas night and the next day packing my clothes, toiletries, and personal items, making sure to grab things my fiancé might not notice were missing right away. The folder felt heavy in my hands when she passed it to me, and she said I needed to look through everything inside before deciding what to do next. We sat at a corner table away from other customers, and I opened the folder while Barrett and Haley leaned in to see. Inside were printed screenshots from my fiancé's phone showing text conversations with his friends, where he complained about me constantly. He called me needy and stupid, discussed strategies for keeping me financially dependent on him, laughed about how I always asked his permission before buying things. There were flirty messages with at least 3 other women, nothing explicitly physical but definitely inappropriate for someone engaged. And there were search history screenshots showing him looking up information about contesting paternity, avoiding child support, and what rights unmarried fathers had. Seeing it all laid out in black and white made my hands shake. His sister pointed to one particular search from 2 days after I told him I was pregnant, asking whether a man could force a woman to take a paternity test. She said she'd printed everything and made copies, that I should give them to a lawyer, and that she'd testify about what she saw if it came to that. That night, I lay awake on Haley's couch long after she went to bed, processing the huge gap between who I thought my fiancé was and who he actually turned out to be. Every sweet moment we'd shared now felt tainted by the knowledge that he was capable of forcing Katrina to serve dinner while she was actively losing their baby. The man who brought me flowers and called me beautiful was the same man who searched for ways to avoid supporting his own child. The person I'd planned to marry had been systematically working to make me dependent and trapped. I kept thinking about all the small things I'd excused or explained away over the past year, the times he got angry, when I spent money without asking, the way he'd slowly pulled me away from my friends, how he always needed to know where I was and who I was with. The pattern had been there all along and I just didn't see it because I loved him and wanted to believe he loved me back. In the morning, I gathered all my courage and pulled up Katrina's number in my phone. I typed out a message thanking her for the warning and asking if she'd be willing to talk with me, then stared at it for 5 minutes before hitting send. Her response came back within minutes saying yes, that she'd been waiting to hear from me and suggesting we meet somewhere public and safe. She said she had things to tell me that would help me understand what I was dealing with, and that she wished someone had warned her before she married him. Reading her words made me cry again, but this time it was different, like maybe I wasn't completely alone in this after all. We agreed to meet the next day at a small cafe on the other side of town, where nobody would recognize either of us. I got there 15 minutes early and sat in a back corner booth, watching the door and feeling my stomach twist into knots. When Katrina walked in, I recognized her immediately from photos I'd seen at his mother's house, but seeing her in person made everything feel more real and urgent. She was shorter than I expected, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and tired eyes that seemed much older than her actual age. She spotted me right away, and walked over without hesitation, sliding into the booth across from me with a sad smile that told me she understood exactly what I was going through. She thanked me for being willing to meet and said she'd been hoping I would reach out ever since she sent those spoons. I asked her why she sent them, and she looked down at her coffee cup for a long moment before answering. She said she couldn't live with herself if she didn't at least try to warn me, even though she knew I might not believe her or might choose to stay with him anyway. She explained that she'd watched him move on so quickly after their divorce, seen him get engaged again, and felt sick knowing another woman was about to walk into the same trap she'd barely escaped from. Katrina started talking about the months before that Christmas 5 years ago, describing how he slowly cut her off from her friends by making her feel guilty every time she wanted to spend time with them. He'd get upset if she made plans without asking him first, or he'd pick fights right before she was supposed to go out so she'd cancel to fix things between them. She said he controlled their money completely, making her ask permission before buying anything and questioning every purchase she made. He'd check her phone constantly, demanding to know who she was texting and getting angry if she didn't respond to his messages immediately. She described how he made her feel crazy for being upset about normal things, telling her she was too sensitive or overreacting or remembering things wrong. The worst part, she said, was how he'd be incredibly sweet and loving right after being cruel, buying her flowers or taking her to dinner and acting like nothing bad had happened. She explained how she lost herself trying to please him, constantly walking on eggshells and second-guessing everything she did. By the time she got pregnant, she was completely isolated from everyone who cared about her, and totally dependent on him financially and emotionally. Katrina took a shaky breath and started describing that Christmas morning 5 years ago in detail that matched exactly what his family had told me. She woke up around 6 with cramping and bleeding, knowing immediately that something was very wrong with the pregnancy. She was 14 weeks along and had been so excited about the baby, already picking out names and setting up a nursery. When she told him she needed to go to the hospital, he got angry and said they couldn't cancel Christmas dinner because his family would ask too many questions, and he didn't want to deal with their drama. She begged him to take her, showing him the blood, but he insisted she was probably fine, and that they'd go after everyone left if she still felt bad. She spent the morning getting worse, the pain increasing and the bleeding getting heavier, but he kept telling her to pull herself together because guests were arriving soon. When his mother showed up with that casserole, Katrina was already wearing 2 pads and a towel in her underwear, feeling dizzy and sick. She served food to his entire family while actively losing their baby, smiling and making small talk while bleeding through her clothes. Everyone pretended not to notice, even though she knew they could tell something was wrong. The pain got so bad during dinner that she had to grip the edge of the table to stay standing, but he glared at her from across the room, and she knew better than to make a scene. After the last guest finally left around 8 that evening, she collapsed on the bathroom floor and stayed there for hours, while he cleaned up downstairs. When she could finally speak again, she crawled to the bedroom and begged him to take her to the emergency room. He said it was too late anyway since the baby was already gone, and that they couldn't afford the hospital bills for something that was basically over. She pointed out that he'd just bought himself a new truck the week before, spending thousands of dollars without asking her opinion. But he said that was different because he needed it for work. She spent the next 3 days recovering at home completely alone while he went to work like nothing had happened. She was bleeding heavily and running a fever, terrified she might die, but he told her she'd be fine and to stop being dramatic. On the 3rd day, when she asked about having a funeral or getting the baby cremated, he laughed and said that was a ridiculous waste of money for something that wasn't really a baby yet. He said it was just a clump of cells and she needed to get over it and move on. Katrina pulled out her phone and showed me a photo of a small section of their old backyard, a patch of earth near the fence marked with a smooth gray river stone. She explained that she waited until he left for work on the 4th day, then went out to the garden shed looking for a shovel. He'd locked the shed and taken the key with him, probably guessing what she wanted to do. She went back inside and looked through the kitchen for something sturdy enough to dig with, and that's when she found the silver serving spoons in the drawer. They were the heaviest, strongest utensils they owned, wedding gifts from his aunt. She took all 6 spoons outside and started digging in the frozen December ground, the temperature below freezing and her hands going numb within minutes. It took her almost 4 hours to dig a hole deep enough, the spoons bending and denting against rocks and frozen soil. Her hands were bleeding by the time she finished, blisters torn open and fingers raw. She buried the baby wrapped in a soft blanket, covered the spot with dirt, and marked it with that river stone. Then she took the spoons inside, washed them carefully, and put them back in the drawer where they stayed until she moved out. Katrina said she started planning her escape about 2 months after that Christmas, secretly saving money and looking for apartments. She opened a new bank account he didn't know about, and had her paychecks deposited there instead. She reconnected with old friends through a secret social media account, and asked them for help when she was ready to leave. The actual leaving happened on a Tuesday morning after he went to work. Her friends showed up with a truck and they loaded everything she owned in less than 2 hours. She left the spoons on the kitchen counter with a note that said only, "I hope you remember what these cost." The divorce took a full year because he fought everything out of pure spite, contesting every single item and dragging out every court date. He tried to claim she owed him money, that she'd stolen from him, that she was mentally unstable. Her lawyer eventually got everything dismissed, but it was exhausting and expensive and traumatic. Katrina looked directly at me and said, I needed to understand that he would try to trap me with this pregnancy, that he'd use the baby to maintain control over me for the rest of my life if I let him. She warned me to document absolutely everything starting right now, to get legal protection in place before he realized I was seriously leaving, and to never underestimate what he was capable of when he felt his control slipping away. I asked if she'd be willing to provide a written statement about everything she just told me, and she said yes immediately without any hesitation. She explained that she'd been in therapy for years working through what he did to her, and that part of her healing process was making sure he couldn't do the same thing to someone else. She said she'd type everything up that evening and email it to me, and that she'd testify in court if needed. That afternoon, I sat in my car outside Haley's building and pulled up the referral list Brianna had given me at my doctor's appointment. The domestic violence hotline number was at the top of the page. I stared at it for almost 10 minutes before finally calling, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. A woman answered on the second ring and said her name was Nicole. I started explaining my situation, stumbling over words and probably not making much sense, but she listened patiently without interrupting. When I finished, she didn't sound shocked or surprised by anything I'd said, which was somehow both comforting and deeply sad. She said she heard stories like mine every single day, that what I was describing was a clear pattern of behavior that had a name. Nicole explained that coercive control is when someone uses tactics like isolation, financial abuse, and emotional manipulation to dominate another person's life. She said the incident with Katrina showed he was capable of extreme cruelty when he felt his control was threatened, and that my pregnancy put me at even higher risk because he'd see the baby as a way to keep me connected to him permanently. She walked me through creating a safety plan, asking detailed questions about my current living situation and what resources I had available. We made a list that included keeping my location completely private from him and anyone who might tell him where I was, documenting every single contact he made through screenshots, and saved voicemails, having a bag packed and ready to grab at any moment with important documents and medications inside, and knowing the fastest route out of any building I was in. Nicole asked me to identify at least 3 people I could call in an emergency who would come get me immediately without asking questions. I gave her Haley's number, Barrett's number, and Katrina's number. Then Nicole started what she called a lethality assessment, going through a specific list of questions about factors that increase danger in domestic violence situations. She asked if he had access to any weapons, and I said no, but realized I didn't actually know for sure since I hadn't been to the house in days. She asked about his history of violence, whether he'd ever hit me or physically restrained me or destroyed property during arguments. I said no to hitting, but yes to punching walls and throwing things when he got angry. She asked if he'd ever threatened to hurt himself or me, if he'd shown obsessive behavior like excessive texting or showing up places unexpectedly, if he'd ever tried to strangle or choke me even during sex, if he monitored my movements or communications. I answered yes to the obsessive texting and monitoring, explained about the location tracking app Barrett found, described how he always needed to know where I was and who I was with. Nicole asked about drug or alcohol use, whether he'd been violent toward animals or children, if there was a history of mental health issues or prior arrests. I didn't know about most of those things, which she said was concerning because it meant he'd been very good at hiding parts of his life from me. She asked specific questions about the pregnancy, whether he'd ever pressured me about birth control or tried to get me pregnant on purpose, whether he'd made threats about custody or taking the baby away. I told her about the search history his sister found, the queries about contesting paternity and avoiding child support. Based on all my answers, Nicole said my situation rated as high risk on their assessment scale. She strongly recommended I file for a protection order before he realized I was seriously leaving, because the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship is right when the victim tries to escape. I left Nicole's office with my head spinning from everything we'd discussed, and when I got back to Haley's apartment that afternoon, I saw 3 missed calls from a number I recognized as my fiancé's mother. There was one voicemail waiting, and I sat down on the couch before pressing play because I didn't know what to expect. Her voice came through shaking and broken, barely holding together as she apologized over and over for not protecting Katrina 5 years ago. She said she should have called the police or driven Katrina to the hospital herself, instead of just standing there watching, and the guilt had been eating at her every single day since. She begged me not to make the same mistake she did by staying silent, and then she said something that made me pause the message and replay it twice to make sure I heard correctly. She would testify to whatever I needed, give a statement, talk to lawyers or police, anything that would help keep me safe from her son. I saved the voicemail and added it to the growing folder of evidence on my phone, then called Barrett because I needed help with something Nicole had mentioned about digital security. He came over within an hour carrying his laptop, and we sat at Haley's kitchen table while he walked me through changing every single password I had. He set up 2-factor authentication on my email, banking, social media, and any other account he could find. Then he had me create a completely new email address that my fiancé didn't know about, one I could use for legal communications and important documents without worrying about him accessing it. Barrett asked to see my phone settings, and that's when he found something that made his jaw tighten. There was a family sharing app installed that I didn't remember ever agreeing to, and when Barrett opened it, we could see that my fiancé had been tracking my exact location in real time for months. The app showed a complete history of everywhere I'd been, down to specific addresses and timestamps, and Barrett's hands were shaking with anger as he immediately deleted it and blocked my fiancé's access to everything. We went through every single app on my phone checking for location sharing, and Barrett turned off anything that could possibly tell my fiancé where I was. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The next morning, I had an appointment with attorney Colin Overton at his office downtown, and Nicole had given me his contact information saying he specialized in domestic violence cases and offered reduced rates. Colin's office was small but professional, with certificates on the walls and a bookshelf full of legal texts, and he shook my hand firmly before gesturing to a chair across from his desk. I spent the next hour telling him everything, showing him the screenshots of controlling messages, explaining about Katrina and the spoons, sharing the recording his sister had sent, and watching him take detailed notes the entire time. Colin reviewed Katrina's contact information and asked if she'd be willing to provide a written statement, which I confirmed she already offered to do. He leaned back in his chair and explained that based on everything I'd shown him, I had solid grounds for a protection order due to the clear pattern of coercive control, and the particularly concerning searches about avoiding paternity that suggested he was already planning how to escape responsibility. Colin pulled out a legal pad and started outlining what the next few months would likely look like, and I tried to focus on his words, even though my mind kept wandering to how surreal this all felt. He explained the process for protection orders, how we'd need to establish paternity if I continued the pregnancy, what custody arrangements might look like, and the possibility of criminal charges if my fiancé violated any court orders. Then Colin looked at me directly and said something I appreciated even though it scared me. The system wasn't perfect, and even with a protection order in place, I needed to stay constantly aware of my safety because paper doesn't actually stop someone who's determined. I left his office feeling both more secure because I had legal help, and more frightened because the danger was so real that even lawyers had to acknowledge it. That afternoon, I had to deal with something I'd been avoiding, which was telling my boss why I needed time off work. I scheduled a meeting and sat across from her desk trying to figure out how much to say. finally deciding on the basic facts without going into traumatic details. I told her I was leaving my fiancé due to safety concerns, that I was pregnant, and that I needed some time to handle legal matters and get settled somewhere secure. My boss didn't ask for more information than I offered, just immediately said she supported me and we'd figure out whatever I needed. She pulled up the FMLA paperwork on her computer and started filling it out right there, then suggested I work from home temporarily, so my fiancé couldn't show up at the office looking for me. The relief of having that conversation go smoothly almost made me cry, because I'd been so worried about losing my job on top of everything else. When I got back to Haley's apartment early that evening, I found a new audio file that my fiancé's sister had sent to my secret email address, with just a short message saying I needed to hear this. She'd secretly recorded a voice message my fiancé left for one of his friends, and when I pressed play, his voice came through casual and relaxed in a way that made my skin crawl. He was bragging to his friend about how well he had me trained, laughing about how I always asked permission before spending money now, and how I apologized first after every argument even when he was clearly wrong. Then he said something that made me feel physically sick, talking about how the pregnancy meant I was locked in now even if I was mad about old history with Katrina. The contempt in his voice when he talked about me was so clear, like I was a pet he'd successfully trained rather than a person he supposedly loved. I listened to the whole thing 3 times, and each time I caught new details that showed just how calculated everything had been. Hearing him describe our relationship in such cold terms destroyed any tiny remaining hope I'd been holding on to, that maybe this was all a misunderstanding, or that he actually cared about me. The way he talked made it obvious that every sweet moment, every apology, every promise had been manipulation designed to keep me dependent and controlled. I'd been making excuses for behavior that was never about love, and the recording proved he'd never seen me as an equal partner, but rather as something to manage and control. The next morning, I met Colin at his office again, and we spent 3 hours preparing a petition for a temporary protection order. We attached printed screenshots of the controlling messages, Katrina's detailed written statement about what happened 5 years ago, the recording his sister had sent of him bragging to his friend, and photos of the silver spoons with their complete history explained. Colin helped me fill out form after form, reducing my entire relationship to a list of specific incidents and concerning behaviors that fit into legal categories. The paperwork felt surreal, seeing everything typed out in formal language that somehow made it both more real and more distant at the same time. We organized everything into a clear timeline showing the pattern of control, and Colin added a section about the pregnancy and the searches about avoiding paternity to demonstrate ongoing risk. When we finished, the petition was over 20 pages long with all the attached evidence, and Colin said it was one of the strongest domestic violence cases he'd seen in terms of documentation. We drove to the courthouse right after finishing the paperwork, and the clerk took our petition and said a judge would review it as soon as possible. I sat in the waiting area with Colin for what felt like hours, but was probably only 90 minutes, and then the clerk called us back and said the judge had granted a temporary protection order. The order required my fiancé to stay at least 500 feet away from me at all times, have no direct or indirect contact, and stay away from Haley's apartment and my workplace. It would remain in effect until a full hearing in 2 weeks where he could contest it if he wanted, but for now I had legal protection. Walking out of that courthouse with the signed order in my hands felt like the first time I could breathe properly in days, but Colin reminded me that the hard part was coming next. My fiancé had to be served with the order, which meant he'd find out where I'd been staying because Haley's address was listed as a protected location. He'd also know I was taking serious legal action, and Colin warned me that this was often when abusers escalated because they realized they were losing control. We discussed the safest way to handle service, and Colin arranged for it to happen at my fiancé's workplace during business hours, when there would be witnesses around and security nearby. The goal was reducing the chance of an immediate dangerous reaction by serving him in a public professional setting, where he'd have to maintain composure, at least initially. I sat on Haley's couch with Barrett on one side and Haley on the other, all 3 of us staring at our phones like they might explode. The waiting felt worse than anything else. So far because I knew the second that process server handed my fiancé those papers, everything would change. Barrett kept checking the tracking app Colin had given us access to, watching the little dot that represented the server move through the city toward my fiancé's workplace. Haley made sandwiches that nobody ate, and I kept getting up to use the bathroom even though I didn't really need to go. My phone buzzed around 1 p.m. with a text from Nicole asking if service had happened yet. I told her no, still waiting, and she sent back a long message about how the first 24 hours after service are statistically the most dangerous time in domestic violence cases. She said I should consider staying somewhere he wouldn't think to look, maybe a hotel or Barrett's place instead of Haley's apartment. The thought made my stomach hurt because it meant this was real, that the man I'd planned to marry was now someone I needed to hide from. Barrett read the message over my shoulder and immediately started looking up hotels near the courthouse, saying he'd pay for it and stay with me if I wanted. Haley argued that her building had good security and cameras everywhere, but I could see the worry in her face. At 2:45 p.m., Barrett's phone lit up with a notification from the tracking app. The server had arrived at my fiancé's office building and was heading inside. We all went completely silent, watching the minutes tick by on the clock. At exactly 3:02 p.m., Colin texted me one word: served. My phone started ringing before I could even process what that meant. My fiancé's name flashed on the screen and I just stared at it until the call went to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. Text messages started flooding in so fast my phone couldn't keep up, the notifications stacking on top of each other. Barrett grabbed my phone and started reading them out loud. The first few were confused, asking what was going on and why I'd filed legal papers against him. Then they got angry, saying I had no right to do this and that he'd done nothing wrong. Then they switched to desperate promises about how he'd change and we could work through this together. By 3:15 p.m., he was sending threats about the baby, saying he'd fight for custody and I'd regret trying to keep his child from him. The messages that made my hands shake were the ones about Katrina, calling her a crazy liar who'd manipulated me into believing her version of events. He said she'd always been dramatic, and that I was being stupid for listening to someone who clearly still had feelings for him. Haley's phone buzzed with a text from Colin telling me not to respond to anything, that every message was potential evidence of harassment. Barrett had already started taking screenshots, his fingers moving fast across my phone screen to capture each new message as it came in. The messages kept coming, getting more frantic and angry with each one. By 3:30 p.m., he was saying he was coming over to talk to me in person, because this was ridiculous, and we needed to handle it like adults. That's when I really started to panic, because Haley's address was listed on the protection order as a place he had to stay away from. Colin sent another text saying to call the police immediately if my fiancé showed up anywhere near me, and to make sure I had the protection order paperwork easily accessible. The afternoon dragged on with my phone buzzing constantly, each message more unhinged than the last. He cycled through every emotion possible, from begging me to come home to threatening to drain our bank accounts, to promising he'd prove Katrina was lying about everything. By 6 p.m., we had over 50 messages, and Colin said that alone was enough to show a pattern of harassment and inability to respect boundaries. Barrett ordered pizza that nobody wanted to eat, and we sat in Haley's living room with the TV on mute, just waiting for something worse to happen. Around 8 p.m., the messages finally slowed down, and I thought maybe he'd given up for the night. I was wrong. At 9:17 p.m., Haley's apartment buzzer started going off, the harsh electronic sound making all three of us jump. Haley went to the intercom panel and listened, her face going pale. She looked at me and mouthed his name. The buzzer went off again, longer this time, like someone was leaning on it, then again, and again. Haley grabbed her phone and called the police while Barrett headed for the door. I tried to follow him, but Haley pulled me back toward her bedroom, saying I needed to stay out of sight. From the bedroom, I could hear the buzzer going off over and over, a constant angry sound that made my heart beat, so fast I felt dizzy. Barrett went down to the lobby to film what was happening, and I sat on Haley's bed with my arms wrapped around myself, listening to Haley talk to the police dispatcher. She was calm and clear, giving them the address and explaining that someone was violating a protection order by showing up at the building. The buzzing finally stopped, and for a few seconds, everything was quiet. Then my phone started ringing again, my fiancé's name flashing on the screen. Haley grabbed it and declined the call, but it immediately rang again. The police dispatcher told Haley they had units on the way, estimated arrival in 8 minutes. Those 8 minutes felt like hours. Barrett came back upstairs and showed us the video he'd taken on his phone. My fiancé was in the lobby, arguing with the security guard and demanding to be led up to Haley's apartment. The guard was telling him no, that he needed to leave, but my fiancé just kept pushing and yelling about how he had a right to see his pregnant fiancée. The police arrived at 9:25 p.m., and Barrett went back down to make sure they had all the information they needed. From the bedroom window, I could see the flashing lights of 2 police cars in the street below. Haley stood next to me, her hand on my shoulder, both of us watching as officers entered the building. It took about 15 minutes before Barrett came back upstairs with one of the officers, a woman who looked tired but professional. She asked to see my copy of the protection order, which I'd been keeping in my purse since leaving the courthouse. She read through it carefully, then asked me to confirm that the man in the lobby was the person named in the order. I said yes, and she nodded and made some notes. The officer explained that they'd verified the protection order with their dispatch, and that my fiancé had been warned he was already in violation by being at the building. They'd told him he needed to leave immediately or face arrest. She said he'd argued and tried to claim he didn't understand the order, but ignorance wasn't an excuse, especially since he'd just been served with it a few hours ago. The officer suggested we file a police report documenting the violation, and that we should contact our attorney about the incident. After she left, Barrett helped me fill out the online report form, while Haley made tea that I still couldn't drink. We thought it was over for the night, but at 9:47 p.m., the building's security guard called Haley to let her know that a car matching my fiancé's had driven past the building slowly 3 times. Haley asked if the cameras had caught it, and the guard said yes, that all the footage was saved automatically. Barrett went down to talk to the building manager about getting copies of the security footage, and came back 20 minutes later with a USB drive containing video from the lobby cameras and the exterior cameras. We watched the footage together, seeing my fiancé's car drive past the building entrance at 9:48 p.m., then again at 9:53 p.m., then again at 10:01 a.m. p.m. On the third pass, he slowed down almost to a stop, clearly looking up at the building windows. Barrett immediately sent everything to Colin, along with the police report number and a detailed timeline of the evening's events. Colin responded within minutes, saying this was exactly the kind of evidence we needed, and that he'd file an additional report in the morning documenting the protection order violation. He reminded me to keep my phone on and charged, to stay away from windows and to call the police immediately if my fiancé showed up again. I finally fell asleep around 2 a.m., exhausted but unable to stop checking my phone every few minutes. The next morning, I woke up to 17 new messages from my fiancé, all sent between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. Most of them were rambling and didn't make much sense, but the tone was getting scarier. At 9:30 a.m., my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A man's voice introduced himself as Detective Edison Root and said he was following up on the protection order violation report from last night. He asked if I had time to talk about what happened, and I said yes, feeling relief wash over me that someone was taking this seriously. Edison explained that violations of protection orders are taken very seriously in their jurisdiction, and that the combination of my fiancé showing up at the building and the 50-plus harassing messages gave them enough to file charges if I wanted to proceed. He said the decision was mine, but that in his experience, abusers who violate protection orders within hours of being served tend to escalate further without legal consequences. I told Edison yes, I wanted charges filed, because I needed my fiancé to understand that there were real consequences now. Edison said he'd coordinate with the prosecutor's office and that this would actually strengthen my case at the full protection order hearing in 2 weeks. He asked me to send him copies of all the messages and the security footage, which Barrett helped me do while we were still on the phone. Edison also warned me that my fiancé might get arrested when the charges were filed, and that I should be prepared for his family or friends to contact me trying to get me to drop the charges. He said I should refer anyone who contacted me to my attorney and not engage with anyone from my fiancé's side. After hanging up with Edison, I felt shaky but also stronger somehow, like I was finally taking real steps to protect myself, instead of just reacting to what was happening. My phone buzzed with a text from Katrina asking if I was okay, saying she'd heard through my fiancé's sister that the protection order had been served. I texted back that I was safe but that he'd already violated it, and she responded immediately with 3 words. I'm not surprised. Katrina asked if there was anything she could do to help, and I said I didn't know yet, but that I appreciated her checking on me. She sent another message saying she'd be willing to testify at the hearing if it would help, and that she'd been documenting her own healing journey in therapy, in case it was ever useful to show the long-term impact of what he'd done to her. That offer made me cry, sitting there on Haley's couch with Barrett making breakfast in the kitchen and morning light coming through the windows. 2 weeks ago, I didn't even know Katrina existed, and now she was offering to relive her trauma in court to help protect me. I had an OB appointment scheduled for that afternoon with Brianna, and Haley insisted on driving me even though I said I could go alone. The waiting room felt too bright and too normal, full of pregnant women reading magazines and looking happy. When Brianna called me back, she took one look at my face and closed the exam room door behind us. I told her everything that had happened since I'd last seen her, and she listened while taking my blood pressure and making notes in my chart. The blood pressure reading was higher than it should be, and Brianna said that wasn't surprising given the stress I was under. She examined me and said the pregnancy itself still looked healthy, that the baby's heartbeat was strong and everything was measuring right on track. But she was worried about me, about the toll this was taking on my body and mind. Brianna adjusted my prenatal vitamins, adding some extra supplements that might help with stress and anxiety. She gave me a list of gentle exercises I could do that were safe for pregnancy and proven to help with anxiety symptoms. Then she said something that made me start crying again. She reminded me that I had options regarding the pregnancy, that no decision had to be made immediately, and that whatever I chose would be supported by her and her entire practice. She said some women in my situation chose to continue pregnancies and some didn't, and both choices were valid and deserved compassionate care. I'd been so focused on protecting myself and the baby that I hadn't really let myself think about whether I even wanted to continue being pregnant with this man's child. Brianna didn't push me to decide anything, just made sure I knew all my options and had resources if I wanted to explore them. Brianna handed me a card with a therapist's name written on it, Jasmine Clearwater, and explained that she specialized in trauma and something called reproductive coercion. She said pregnancy after finding out about abuse created really complicated feelings that I'd probably need help working through. Brianna looked right at me and said whatever I decided about keeping the baby was valid and deserved good care. No judgment either way. I took the card and scheduled an appointment for 3 days later, my hands still shaking from everything I'd just told her. The first session with Jasmine felt weird at first, sitting in her office with soft lighting and tissues on every table, but after about 10 minutes something shifted, and I could actually breathe normally for the first time in weeks. Jasmine listened to me talk about still loving my fiancé sometimes even though I knew what he did, and she didn't look shocked or tell me I was crazy. She said it was completely normal to be confused about loving someone who turned out to be dangerous, that abuse worked by being invisible until suddenly it wasn't anymore. I cried when she said I shouldn't be angry at myself for not seeing the signs sooner, because he'd designed everything to be hidden. During our second session, Jasmine introduced this concept called trauma bonding, and suddenly everything made sense. She explained why I still had moments of missing my fiancé, even knowing he forced Katrina to host dinner while losing their baby. The good times weren't random. They were part of how he kept control, making me grateful for basic kindness after he'd been mean or cold. Jasmine showed me a chart about cycles of abuse, and I recognized every single phase, the tension building and the explosion, and then the apology and the honeymoon period where everything felt perfect again. She helped me see that my brain had been trying to make sense of someone who was sometimes loving and sometimes scary, and that confusion was actually a survival response. I started going to a support group that met twice a week at a community center across town, and walking into that first meeting felt like entering a secret club I never wanted to join. There were 8 other women there, all different ages and backgrounds, and hearing their stories made me feel less alone, even though their situations were all awful. One woman talked about how her ex would take her car keys and hide them so she couldn't leave the house. Another described her partner reading all her texts and emails, which reminded me of how my fiancé always wanted to know exactly where I was. The facilitator gave really practical advice about legal stuff and rebuilding your life that I wrote down in a notebook I kept just for group. At the third meeting, a woman named Sarah shared that she'd gotten pregnant right before leaving her abuser and decided to keep the baby. She worked with a family lawyer to set up custody arrangements that kept her safe, including supervised visits and exchanges at a police station. Sarah looked right at me when she talked about it, like she somehow knew I was dealing with the same choice and said it was possible to be a mother without being trapped. Her story gave me hope, but I still felt so uncertain about what I actually wanted to do, whether I could handle raising a child connected to my fiancé forever. Barrett met me at a bank across town the next morning to help me open a new account that my fiancé didn't know about. We transferred half of our shared savings, which was legally mine anyway, but discovered that he'd already moved almost $6,000 to an account I'd never heard of. Barrett took screenshots of everything, and I felt sick realizing my fiancé had been preparing for me to leave, hiding money where I couldn't get it. I texted Colin about it, and he said we could address it in court, but it confirmed what I already suspected, that my fiancé had been planning his next moves this whole time. The next day, I went back to the house with a police escort, Barrett and Haley, to get the rest of my stuff. Walking through the door felt surreal, like I was visiting a museum of my old life instead of a place I'd lived for 2 years. Everything looked the same but felt completely foreign and cold, and I moved through the rooms quickly grabbing clothes and personal items while the officer stood in the doorway. Haley packed up my bathroom stuff and Barrett loaded boxes into his truck, and I kept expecting my fiancé to show up even though I knew he was at work. We finished in under an hour and drove everything to a storage unit Barrett had rented, and I felt grateful we got out without any confrontation. 2 days later, the buzzer rang at Haley's apartment, and it was my fiancé's mother. I told Haley not to let her up and instead went down to meet her in the lobby where the security guard could see us. She was crying and holding a card with what looked like money inside, saying she wanted to help pay for whatever I needed. I took the card, but told her gently that I needed space from his entire family right now, while I figured out my next steps. She nodded and hugged me before leaving and back upstairs. I opened the card to find $500 and a note saying she was sorry for everything. The morning of the full protection order hearing arrived, and I woke up feeling like I might throw up. Colin, Barrett, and Nicole all met me at the courthouse steps, and just having them there made it slightly less scary to walk through those doors. My fiancé was already inside with his own attorney, a man in an expensive suit who kept whispering to him. Seeing my fiancé in person for the first time since Christmas dinner made my hands shake, so badly that Barrett had to help me sit down. The hearing started and Colin stood up to present our evidence, his voice calm and methodical as he went through everything. He showed the judge screenshots of controlling messages where my fiancé told me what to wear and who I could see. He played the recording where my fiancé bragged to his friend about having me trained to ask permission before spending money. Colin read Katrina's written statement about the Christmas 5 years ago, her words clear and detailed about serving dinner while losing the baby. He showed photographs of the spoons with their dents and scratches, explaining how Katrina used them to dig her baby's grave in frozen ground. Colin presented documentation of every time my fiancé violated the temporary protection order, including the night he showed up at Haley's building. Finally, he called my fiancé's sister to testify about her brother's escalating anger and the threatening messages she'd seen on his phone. The fiancé's attorney stood up next, his expensive suit crisp as he addressed the judge with practiced confidence. He claimed the messages were taken out of context, that young couples have disagreements, that what happened with Katrina was a tragic medical event my fiancé handled poorly because he was young and stressed. He talked about how people make mistakes and deserve second chances, how the incident was 5 years ago and my fiancé had grown since then. But then the judge looked directly at my fiancé and asked him to explain why he made Katrina host dinner while she was actively miscarrying. My fiancé opened his mouth, closed it, then started stammering about how he didn't understand how serious it was at the time. He said something about not wanting to worry his family, about thinking Katrina was exaggerating her symptoms. His voice got quieter with each word, and even his own attorney looked uncomfortable watching him try to justify what he'd done. The judge's expression didn't change, but I saw her write something down, her pen moving quickly across her notepad. Then Katrina appeared on the large screen at the front of the courtroom, and the whole room seemed to hold its breath. She looked calm and put together, sitting in what appeared to be a home office with soft lighting behind her. The judge thanked her for joining via video call and asked her to describe what happened that Christmas 5 years ago. Katrina's voice was steady and clear as she walked through every detail, from feeling the cramping start that morning to my fiancé insisting they couldn't cancel because people were already on their way. She described serving appetizers while blood soaked through her clothes, smiling at guests while pain tore through her body, asking him 3 separate times to take her to the hospital, and being told to wait until everyone left. She explained how she finally collapsed in the upstairs bathroom after the last guest departed, how she lay on the cold tile floor for hours before he finally checked on her. Her composure was powerful, each word precise and factual, no crying or dramatic pauses, just the truth laid out in careful detail. I watched my fiancé's attorney shuffle papers and avoid looking at the screen, clearly realizing there was no way to question her without looking cruel. When Katrina finished, the judge thanked her again, and she nodded before the screen went dark. My fiancé's sister took the witness stand next, her hands shaking slightly as she was sworn in. She testified about growing up watching her brother manipulate people, about how he'd always been good at making others doubt their own perceptions. She described finding the searches on his phone about avoiding paternity and child support, about the threatening messages he'd sent after being served with the temporary order. Her voice cracked when she talked about feeling guilty for not protecting Katrina better, for not speaking up sooner when she saw the warning signs. She looked directly at me when she described his behavior after the temporary order was issued, how he'd raged about me turning his family against him, how he'd talked about teaching me a lesson. The testimony clearly pained her, but she didn't back down or soften any details, and I felt grateful for her courage even as I saw tears running down her face. The judge asked a few clarifying questions, then dismissed her with what seemed like genuine respect in her tone. Then the judge announced she needed 15 minutes to review the evidence and deliberate. Those 15 minutes felt like hours as I sat between Barrett and Colin, my hands twisted together in my lap. I could feel my fiancé staring at me from across the courtroom, but I refused to look in his direction. When the judge returned, she didn't waste time with long explanations. She granted a 1-year protection order with conditions that made my chest feel tight with relief. My fiancé had to stay 1,000 feet away from me at all times, have absolutely no direct or indirect contact, surrender any firearms within 24 hours, and complete a domestic violence intervention program. The judge's voice was firm as she noted that any violations would result in immediate arrest and potential jail time, and that she was taking this seriously given the documented history and concerning behavior patterns. As we stood to leave the courtroom, I felt Barrett's hand on my elbow guiding me toward the exit. We were halfway down the hallway when I heard rapid footsteps behind us. My fiancé pushed past his own attorney who was trying to grab his arm and got close enough that I could see the anger in his eyes. Barrett immediately stepped between us as my fiancé said the words that made my blood run cold. Edison appeared from where he'd been standing near the courtroom doors, already pulling out his phone to document what was happening. He stepped forward with his badge visible and told my fiancé to step back, that he was violating the protection order that had been issued less than 5 minutes ago. My fiancé started to argue, but Edison cut him off, telling him he was under arrest. I watched as Edison pulled out handcuffs and secured them around my fiancé's wrists while reading him his rights. My fiancé's face went from angry to shocked to something like panic as Edison led him back toward the courthouse security office. The whole thing happened so fast that I barely processed it until Barrett was guiding me outside into the cold afternoon air. That evening at Haley's apartment, I sat on the couch staring at nothing while the reality sank in. I was pregnant with a child whose father was now facing criminal charges and had a year-long protection order against him. Jasmine had offered to meet with me that same day, and I'd said yes because I didn't know how to process any of this alone. She helped me work through what I was feeling about the pregnancy without pushing me toward any particular choice. She asked questions about what I wanted for my life, what scared me most, what kind of support I had available. We talked about the fact that continuing or ending the pregnancy were both valid choices, and that whatever I decided needed to be right for me, not based on fear or pressure or what anyone else thought I should do. Over the next few days, I thought about almost nothing else. I made lists of pros and cons, talked to Haley and Barrett, cried in the shower, and tried to imagine both futures. After 5 days of turning it over in my mind, I realized I wanted to continue the pregnancy, but with clear boundaries about my fiancé's involvement. Colin explained the legal reality when I met with him, that I couldn't prevent my fiancé from eventually seeking custody or visitation rights, but we could request supervised visitation given his documented history and the protection order, and we could build a case for safety provisions that would protect both me and the baby. He helped me understand that the protection order gave us a strong foundation to argue for supervised access only, and that the criminal charges from violating the order would further support our position. Brianna connected me with a specialized OB practice that had experience with what she called high-risk social situations. The doctors there didn't blink when I explained my situation, and they immediately started creating a birth plan that was included security measures. They added instructions to my medical chart that my fiancé was not to be notified when I went into labor and was not allowed access to me or the baby during delivery or recovery. They gave me a special bracelet to wear that would alert hospital security if needed, and assigned me a patient advocate who would be present during my entire hospital stay. 2 weeks after the hearing, I moved into a small apartment that Barrett had helped me find in a building with good security. I used money from my savings account and a loan from my parents who had flown out to support me as soon as they heard everything that happened. The apartment was just a one-bedroom on the 3rd floor, but it had good light and felt safe and quiet. Having my own space felt like the first real step toward building a life that was truly mine, not controlled or watched or managed by anyone else. I spent the first night there sitting on the floor of the empty living room, eating takeout with Barrett and Haley, and feeling something that might have been hope starting to grow alongside the fear. The next morning, I texted Katrina and asked if she wanted to meet for coffee sometime. She responded within minutes saying yes and suggested a quiet place near her work. We met that Thursday afternoon and talked for 2 hours straight about everything from the practical details of leaving to the weird guilt that comes with grieving a future that never really existed. She didn't sugarcoat anything or tell me it would be easy, but she also didn't make me feel stupid for having loved him or for being scared now. Over the next few weeks, those coffee meetings became a regular thing, usually twice a week at the same cafe where the staff started knowing our orders. Katrina helped me understand that what I was feeling wasn't weakness or confusion, but a normal response to discovering that someone you trusted was capable of cruelty you never imagined. She shared parts of her own healing journey, not to compare our situations, but to show me that it was possible to build a life after escaping, that the grief and anger and fear wouldn't always feel this overwhelming. 3 months after that Christmas dinner, I settled into a routine that felt surprisingly stable, even though everything had changed. Tuesday and Thursday mornings, I had therapy with Jasmine, who helped me untangle the complicated feelings about my pregnancy and my ex, and the future I was building. Wednesday afternoons, I went to prenatal appointments where Brianna checked on the baby and reminded me that taking care of myself emotionally was just as important as the physical health stuff. Monday and Friday evenings, I attended the support group at the community center, listening to other women's stories and slowly learning to share my own without feeling ashamed. I worked from home most days, which gave me flexibility for appointments, and also meant I didn't have to worry about running into my ex anywhere. The spoon sat in a cardboard box in my closet, wrapped in tissue paper, a reminder of what I escaped and the woman who survived before me and sent them as a warning. I was learning slowly that safety and peace were worth more than any false promise of perfect love, and that choosing myself and my baby over staying in a relationship that could have destroyed us both wasn't selfish but necessary. And that's the wrap-up for today. I like when simple stories end up holding real lessons in them. If this one helped you look at something a little differently, that's what matters. Subscribe so you'll be ready for the next one.